India, but there's also the big election that's happening in the US next year, and it's most likely going to be yet again a Trump versus Biden rematch. Joe Biden has announced earlier this week that he is going to run in 2024, and Trump has already announced that he is running. Right now, he is the leading Republican candidate. What has changed between 2020 and now is that Donald Trump is an indicted former president, the first ever to have that ignominy. Will that make a difference to his voter base, or will that actually charge up his voter base? Will an indicted Trump be able to defeat Biden when an incumbent Trump could not in 2020? And how does America and its institutions protect the result of the next election without the losing side, whichever it may be, descending into violence like we saw on the 6th of January 2021? Michael Gerhardt is a distinguished professor of constitutional law at the University of North Carolina. He now joins me. Thank you very much, Professor Gerhardt, for joining us. On this whole Trump indictment, the first former president in the history of the United States in over 250 years to be indicted on criminal charges, what do you think the impact of this would be? Of course, it doesn't stop him from running again, but how do you see this playing out for Donald Trump? Would voters be skeptical of him because of these charges, or would his base actually be more enthused to come out and support him because they see this as part of some design, or he's being unfairly targeted, what have you?
Well, in the short term, I think this plays out pretty well for Donald Trump. He likes being a martyr. He likes sort of positioning himself as a victim and somebody who is always being targeted by the so-called left. And since the indictment that currently stands won't come to trial anytime soon, he's going to be able to run as presidential candidate based in part on the fact that he's still a victim. In the long run, it could become a problem because he could be convicted. And at some point, if he's convicted under this current indictment or under some other indictment, that could pose a problem for Trump. He'll have opportunities to appeal, but if he loses those appeals, he will be in a position of being subject to going to prison. And his being a former president won't stop any of that.
So the response to this has also been on political lines. The response to this indictment, when you have potential GOP presidential candidates, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, they've all criticized the indictment, saying that it is partisan. It was playing to a script. It was pre-designed. The Democrats, of course, have come out and welcomed it and said that this is yet another example of why Trump is unfit to run for office again. Is there a legal case? Because once again, because of the polarized times that America seems to be living in, is this legal indictment also being seen purely from a political or polarized prism?
Yes, and again, because as you have noted, we have a former president here who is the subject of that indictment, and a person who enjoys being in the spotlight and the center of attention. So if anything happens to that person, in this case an indictment, it just feeds into his narrative of, as I said, of being a victim, but also allows him to go public and bash the government. The thing about an indictment is that it takes time for a criminal proceeding to unfold, oftentimes 1.5 to 2 years for that indictment to unfold, become a trial, if there's a conviction and an appeal. So during all that time, the Republicans can politicize it. But indictments are tried not in the court of public opinion, they're tried in the court of law. So whatever happens in public isn't going to influence or shape what happens in that indictment and subsequent criminal prosecution.
Let's talk about the People's Court, because now we have heard earlier this week that Joe Biden is going to run for 2024. Many are predicting that it's going to be once again Trump versus Biden. It's going to be a rematch from 2020. Do you think that's the most likely scenario that's going to play out? And one of the things that Biden said in his campaign video is that this is a fight for America's soul, for America's democracy. And he says the job is not done yet. Is that a message that will resonate with the American people? Because he said it in 2020, he won. The American people reposed their faith in him. But would they be willing to buy that message again? Because as he says in that video, it's unfinished business according to him.
Well, it's a really excellent question. And I guess this is that question will hang over the entire campaign because, as you pointed out, that's what's at stake. For the Democrats, what's at stake is protecting democracy and protecting the rule of law. For Donald Trump and Republicans, it's apparently upsetting the system, allowing for preferred treatment for people who happen to be Republicans and demonizing Democrats. That's what this election will be all about. But in the long run, I think President Biden is right because this is a fight over America's soul, and each side has a different conception of what that soul happens to be.
Looks like, yeah.
Biden's fighting, as you pointed out, for democracy. Trump is fighting largely, I think, for Trump. If there's a higher principle there, I've yet to figure it out.
One of the other big legal issues, which is now again going to have a huge impact on the political landscape in the run-up to 2024, is the ramifications of abortion rights. The Supreme Court in the U.S. overturning Roe v. Wade. Now we have individual states trying to find a way to circumvent it. Do you see this becoming a big issue in 2024? And do you see, women as a voting class sort of rallying around this issue, making it the #1 talking point in 2024, making it almost like a vote-determining issue for half the electorate?
I think there's no doubt whatsoever that abortion rights will be a major issue, maybe even the major issue for a lot of voters. Women undoubtedly will come out to the polls, perhaps in greater numbers than they have before. We've seen that in the last series of elections. In the midterm elections, we saw that as a phenomenon. We saw that as a phenomenon in Wisconsin, where a liberal judge won, in part because she vowed to protect abortion rights. There's no question that abortion rights matter a great deal to women, and they will come out to protect their interests and their bodies. And that means the other side will be people who want to regulate women and regulate abortions. And so that's a contest. That's a major clash. And I don't think women are going to sit at home, whatever side there are on this issue, letting other people decide it for them. I think they're going to try and be heard and let their voice be loud and their message very clear.
Now, one of the issues also, if it's going to be Trump versus Biden again in 2024, is the question of age. Mr. Biden is 82 today. If he wins, and by the time he finishes his second term, he's going to be 86. Trump is also close to 80. And I think it was one of the candidates, I'm not sure if it was Nikki Haley, I think, who said that there should be an age criteria for people to run, because arguably this is the most stressful job on the planet. The person, whoever he or she may be, who eventually gets elected, has to be young, fit, healthy, and of good physical and mental stamina to be able to do this tough job. Is that something that Americans care about?
I'm sure it is something ordinary Americans will care about. I think age here is a factor. Although I do recall the debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale many, many years ago, and Mondale had been making that point that Reagan was going to be too old, and Reagan sort of turned the tables on Mondale in a debate by saying, "I'm not going to use my opponent's youth against him." So I think what President Reagan said back then is what we might likely hear now, which is what Biden and Trump, I suppose, could argue is they have a lot of experience. Each has been president. That means they can hit the ground running on day one. Somebody younger may or may not have the kind of experience, or more importantly, the judgment that I think is essential for an American president to have. So age will be a factor, judgment will be a factor, experience will be a factor. And oftentimes elections come down not to some general principle about somebody being too old or too young or inexperienced. It's going to come down to which of the two candidates is preferable to the voter. You only have to beat the other person to become president of the United States. And so there'll be a great deal of focus ultimately in the election, not so much on age and experience, but in the abstract, but in terms of how those factors weigh in, given the candidates we have.
There was a Gallup poll recently which suggested that I think it was close to 2/3 of all Americans identify themselves with either of the two mainstream parties, either identify themselves as Republican or Democrat. And there are very few Americans who identify themselves as independent. And over the years, that space has been decreasing. What is the incentive? You believe that there is far less incentive today to the two mainstream parties to cater to that independent vote when a large majority already identify themselves with either of these two parties. So the focus is just on turning out the base.
That's a good question. It's a tough question. The election is likely to be close, in which case both candidates will probably focus on trying to get independent vote. But I think, though, the statistics you just shared with us reflect, in my opinion, the tremendous divide, the greater differences that exist between being a Republican and being a Democrat. In the past, one might argue, I never really agreed with this argument, but in the past, one might argue that the parties had more in common than disagreement. Right now, it seems as if the parties are so different and the candidates are so different that independents, I think, become less important, in part because even independents recognize, given those differences, those sharp differences, they've got to participate in a way that matters, in a way that could have impact. And that means they'll have to probably pick being a Democrat or a Republican for purposes of the election. I think there's a world of difference between whoever the Democratic nominee will be, though it's likely to be Biden, and whoever the Republican nominee will be, because they have such sharp differences of opinion about all the issues that matter to the American people, beginning with abortion rights, but extending to all over the map, including the use of military force, as well as who really poses a danger to the United States. For Republicans, it's the Democrats. For Democrats, it's oftentimes foreign enemies and people who have attacked American forces.
I also want to talk to you a little bit about this other big legal case that happened in recent days, the one between Fox News, one of the major networks in the U.S., getting into a legal settlement, one of the biggest legal settlements in the history of the United States, between them and a voting machine company, Dominion, apparently on the back of false claims that the network made about the 2020 elections, doubting the credibility of those voting machines, doubting the credibility of the election results itself. Once again, highlighting this whole problem of election deniers and fake news. Do you believe the 2024 election will also be could potentially be victim to this sort of, election denying syndrome or this fake news narrative, as it were?
Yes, I do think that this election will feature yet again the sharp divide between Republican voters and their nominee, who is likely to either make up facts or ignore facts, versus the Democratic nominee, who may well sort of embellish things, but at least in my opinion, not likely to disregard reality. And so those sharp differences will manifest themselves throughout the campaign. The idea of fake news, which Donald Trump has pushed and many of his supporters push, is really a push against just facts they don't like. And so Democrats will use those facts because, at least from their perspective, those facts are helpful to them. And that will produce an odd kind of clash. In America, we've suddenly found ourselves sort of disagreeing about how to determine the truth and how much the truth matters.
And one of the fallouts, and final question, one of the fallouts of this case, the Dominion versus Fox case, is that one of their big stars, Tucker Carlson, was reportedly fired by the network a few days ago. He had put out a video yesterday in which he made a rather interesting claim. He said there is some kind of consensus in America between both the parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and it's a system that only benefits the wealthy and the elite. And he says suddenly America looks very much like a one-party state. How do you view this? Is America a one-party state? And also, how do you view the ability of people like Tucker Carlson, who played a big role in fomenting this whole election-denying business?
Well, I, of course, have no inside information as to why Tucker Carlson got fired. But at the same time, there were revelations from his emails about derogatory characterizations as well as language directed at people that were his bosses. That's probably never a good thing to do or to have revealed. But I think that what Tucker Carlson also did, as you just pointed out, is he put together a narrative that made the viewers happy and pleased. And in that narrative, facts are relatively unimportant or oftentimes absent. And I think what this election may sort of bring to bear is not so much that we have a one-party system. I don't think there's any real evidence of that at all. But instead, how much, again, do facts matter? How much does evidence matter? How much does truth matter? It used to be both sides could almost agree that, yes, facts matter and truth matters. Now that's not even true. And it's the disappearance of that common ground, I think, that makes this election so difficult and ultimately the stakes so important.
And of course, the critical issue of how to protect the election result, that everybody has faith in institutions that have declared those results, and the other side does not descend into violence just because they have ended up on the losing side of that election. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Professor Michael Gerhardt, for joining us with your fascinating insights into how the American race for the White House in 2024 is shaping up. Thanks for your time. I'll catch you again.